Thousands of years ago, while much of the world was still struggling to build civilizations, China was already one of the greatest empires on earth, a land of emperors, massive armies, breathtaking inventions, and ancient wisdom. China gave the world paper, gunpowder, printing, silk, and the compass, inventions that changed human history forever. The Chinese Empire was rich, powerful, and respected across Asia for centuries. Massive trade routes known as the Silk Road connected China to the Middle East and Europe, bringing wealth and influence to the empire. Cities flourished, dynasties rose and fell, and millions believed China would remain the center of the world forever. But history is cruel, and even the greatest empires can fall. By the 1800s, China faced one of the darkest periods in its history. Western powers began arriving with advanced weapons, warships, and ambitions of domination. Britain, France, and other European nations wanted access to Chinese markets and resources, but China resisted foreign control. What followed changed China forever. In 1839, the First Opium War began after Britain illegally flooded China with opium, a deadly drug that destroyed millions of Chinese lives. When Chinese authorities tried to stop the trade, Britain launched military attacks with modern naval technology that China could not match. The result was humiliation. China lost the war and was forced to sign unequal treaties, giving away territory and trade rights to foreign powers. Hong Kong was handed over to Britain, foreign influence spread across Chinese cities, and the once proud empire began collapsing from within. Soon, more disasters followed. Rebellions, famine, corruption, and foreign invasions weakened the nation even further. Japan, once inspired by Chinese civilization, defeated China in war and shocked the world. For the Chinese people, this period became known as the Century of Humiliation, a time when China was poor, divided, weak, and controlled by outsiders. Millions suffered while the ruling Qing dynasty lost its grip on power. By the early 1900s, China was on the edge of total collapse. Revolution spread across the country, and in 1911, the Qing dynasty finally fell, ending over 2,000 years of imperial rule. But freedom did not bring stability. Instead, China descended into chaos. Warlords controlled different regions, civil war erupted, and ordinary people lived in extreme poverty. Then came another nightmare, the invasion of Imperial Japan. In 1937, Japan launched a brutal attack on China during the Second Sino-Japanese War. Entire cities were destroyed, millions were killed, and horrifying atrocities shocked humanity. The Nanjing Massacre became one of the darkest chapters in modern history as civilians were murdered on a massive scale. China was bleeding, broken, and desperate for survival. But out of this destruction emerged a new force that would eventually reshape the entire world, the Chinese Communist Party led by Mao Zedong. Mao promised unity, revolution, and freedom from foreign domination. After years of civil war between the communists and the nationalists, Mao's forces achieved victory in 1949. Standing in Beijing, Mao declared the birth of the People's Republic of China. For millions of Chinese citizens, it felt like the beginning of a new era. China was finally united again after decades of war and humiliation. But rebuilding a shattered nation would not be easy. Mao wanted to transform China into a powerful communist state capable of standing against the West and the Soviet Union. Land was taken from wealthy landlords and redistributed to peasants. Industries were nationalized, private businesses disappeared, and the government took control over nearly every aspect of life. Massive campaigns were launched to reshape Chinese society. At first, many believed the revolution would bring prosperity and equality, but the reality became far more complicated. In 1958, Mao introduced a massive economic campaign called the Great Leap Forward. The goal was ambitious: transform China from an agricultural society into an industrial superpower almost overnight. Villages were forced into giant communes, farmers were ordered to produce steel in backyard furnaces, and unrealistic production targets spread across the country. Officials exaggerated success because they feared punishment, while food shortages became catastrophic. What followed was one of the deadliest famines in human history. Tens of millions of people died from starvation. Entire communities collapsed, families suffered in silence, and China entered another period of pain and instability. Yet Mao refused to fully admit failure. In the 1960s, he launched another radical movement known as the Cultural Revolution. Mao feared that China was drifting away from communist ideology, so he encouraged young people called the Red Guards to attack anything considered old or bourgeois. Schools closed, intellectuals were humiliated, historical sites were destroyed, and chaos spread across the nation. Neighbors turned against neighbors, families were torn apart, and fear dominated society. China became isolated from much of the world while its economy struggled to survive. But despite the suffering and turmoil, one thing slowly emerged from this period: an intense determination among Chinese leaders never to let their country become weak again. After Mao's death in 1976, China stood at a crossroads. The country was still poor, technologically behind, and economically weak compared to Western nations. Many outsiders believed China would never become a major global power. But then a quiet, pragmatic leader named Deng Xiaoping changed everything. Unlike Mao, Deng believed ideology alone could not make China strong. He famously said, "It doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice." His message was simple: results mattered more than rigid communist theory. Deng launched economic reforms that shocked the communist world. Farmers were allowed to sell surplus crops for profit, foreign companies were invited to invest in China, and special economic zones were created in cities like Shenzhen. What was once a small fishing town suddenly transformed into one of the fastest-growing cities on Earth. Factories appeared everywhere. Millions of workers moved from rural villages into industrial cities searching for opportunity. China became the factory of the world. Cheap labor, massive production, and government planning allowed Chinese goods to flood global markets. From toys and electronics to clothing and machinery, products stamped with Made in China spread across every continent. Western companies rushed to China because manufacturing costs were low and profits were enormous. Over time, China's economy began growing at an unbelievable speed. Hundreds of millions of people escaped extreme poverty in what became one of the greatest economic transformations in human history. New highways, airports, skyscrapers, and high-speed rail networks changed the landscape of the nation. Cities expanded at breathtaking speed. Shanghai became a symbol of futuristic ambition filled with glowing skyscrapers and financial power. Beijing modernized rapidly as China prepared to reintroduce itself to the world not as a weak nation, but as a rising giant. Yet behind this economic miracle was a government that maintained strict political control. The Communist Party remained firmly in power, censorship increased, and protests were often crushed harshly. In 1989, thousands of students gathered in Beijing's Tiananmen Square demanding political reform and greater freedom. The world watched as demonstrations grew larger, but the Chinese government responded with military force. The crackdown shocked the international community, yet China's leadership remained focused on stability and economic growth above all else. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, China's rise accelerated even faster. Factories multiplied, exports exploded, and foreign investment poured into the country. China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, opening the door for even deeper integration into the global economy. Suddenly, Chinese manufacturing became unstoppable. The country produced electronics, smartphones, computers, steel, ships, and consumer goods on a scale never seen before. Gigantic cities emerged almost overnight. Millions entered the middle class. Wealth increased, infrastructure expanded, and China's influence grew stronger every year. By the early 21st century, the world realized something historic was happening. The same country that had once suffered invasion, humiliation, famine, and collapse was now becoming one of the most powerful nations on earth. But this was only the beginning, because China no longer wanted to simply manufacture products for the world. It wanted to dominate technology, military power, artificial intelligence, space exploration, and global influence itself, and in the next chapter, the rise of China would become a direct challenge to the United States and the balance of power across the entire planet. As the world entered the 21st century, China was no longer a poor nation struggling to survive. It had become an economic giant, a manufacturing empire, and a country with ambitions far greater than simply producing cheap products for the rest of the world. Chinese leaders understood that true global dominance could not depend only on factories and exports. If China wanted long-term power, it had to control technology, innovation, military strength, infrastructure, trade routes, and influence across continents. In the background of booming cities and rising wealth, a new vision for China was quietly taking shape, a vision that would transform the balance of global power. As China's economy exploded, skyscrapers rose across cities like Shanghai, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, and Beijing at breathtaking speed. Millions of people moved into modern apartments, high-speed rail networks stretched across the country, and giant airports connected China to nearly every corner of the world. Entire cities appeared where villages had once stood. China invested billions into roads, ports, railways, dams, bridges, and futuristic infrastructure on a scale the modern world had rarely seen. For many Chinese citizens, life changed dramatically within a single generation. Families that had once struggled in poverty suddenly entered the middle class. Education expanded, technology spread rapidly, and economic opportunities grew faster than almost anywhere else on Earth. Yet China wanted more than economic success, it wanted influence. Under the leadership of Xi Jinping, China entered a new era of confidence and ambition. Xi promoted what became known as the Chinese Dream, the vision of restoring China to greatness after centuries of weakness and humiliation. One of the biggest symbols of this ambition became the massive Belt and Road Initiative, an enormous project connecting Asia, Europe, Africa, and beyond through railways, highways, ports, pipelines, and trade investments. China invested in foreign infrastructure from ports in Asia to roads in Africa and rail systems in Europe, creating economic ties that increased its global influence. Supporters called it economic cooperation and development, while critics feared it gave China too much geopolitical leverage over weaker economies. Either way, one thing became clear: China was no longer thinking like a regional power. It was thinking like a future superpower. At the same time, China began aggressively investing in technology and innovation. For decades, critics dismissed China as merely a country that copied Western inventions. But China aimed to rewrite that image completely. Massive investments flowed into artificial intelligence, robotics, electric vehicles, quantum computing, biotechnology, and telecommunications. Chinese companies grew rapidly, shocking global markets, became one of the world's most powerful telecommunications firms, competing fiercely in smartphones and 5G networks, owned by transformed global social media culture, reaching hundreds of millions of users worldwide and becoming one of the most influential digital platforms on Earth. Chinese electric vehicle makers expanded aggressively, while digital payment systems and smart cities reshaped everyday life inside China. In many areas, China no longer wanted to catch up with the West, it wanted to surpass it. Then came another battlefield: space. For decades, space exploration had been dominated by powers like the United States and Russia, but China entered the race with determination. Chinese scientists launched satellites, lunar missions, and space laboratories, eventually building their own space station and sending astronauts into orbit. Missions explored the moon, Mars, and deep space, signaling that China intended to compete at the highest scientific level. But while China rose, tensions with the United States grew stronger. For decades, America had been the dominant global superpower, leading the world in finance, military capability, culture, and technology. Now, a challenger was emerging at extraordinary speed. What began as economic competition soon evolved into something much larger, a geopolitical rivalry that many experts described as the defining struggle of the 21st century. Trade wars erupted as tariffs hit billions of dollars in goods. Political leaders accused each other of unfair economic practices, industrial spying, cybersecurity threats, and unfair competition. Technology became one of the biggest battlegrounds, especially around semiconductors, artificial intelligence, and telecommunications. The United States restricted certain Chinese technologies, while China accelerated efforts to build domestic alternatives and reduce dependence on foreign systems. Behind the scenes, both nations understood something deeply important. Whoever controls advanced technology may shape the future of civilization itself. But China's rise was not only economic or technological, it was also military. For decades, China modernized its armed forces with enormous investment. The Chinese Navy expanded rapidly, advanced fighter jets entered service, missile systems improved, cyber warfare capabilities strengthened, and military exercises increased dramatically. China focused heavily on anti-ship missiles, naval expansion, drones, and modern warfare technologies designed to challenge powerful rivals. Tensions surrounding Taiwan became one of the world's most dangerous flashpoints. China views Taiwan as part of its territory, while many in Taiwan support maintaining their separate political system. The issue created global anxiety because any future conflict could involve major powers and disrupt the world economy. Meanwhile, disputes in the South China Sea added even more tension as China expanded territorial claims in strategically important waters crossed by massive amounts of international trade. Yet despite growing power, China also faced major internal challenges. Economic slowdowns raised concerns after decades of extraordinary growth. A shrinking population and aging workforce created long-term pressures. Youth unemployment, housing debt, and inequality sparked debate inside the country. Strict political control remained controversial internationally, while censorship and surveillance systems expanded. Critics argued that freedom of speech and political dissent faced severe restrictions, while supporters insisted stability and development mattered most for national progress. China's government defended its model as proof that economic success did not require adopting Western political systems. The world watched carefully, asking a historic question: could China redefine what a modern superpower looks like? At the same time, Chinese culture, media, and influence spread globally through business, entertainment, trade, and education. Universities welcomed international students, Chinese products entered nearly every home, and supply chains became deeply dependent on Chinese manufacturing. Entire industries across the globe relied on China for electronics, machinery, pharmaceuticals, batteries, and raw materials. The COVID-19 era revealed just how interconnected the world had become with China's economy. Suddenly, one nation's factories affected global markets everywhere. As the years passed, one reality became impossible to ignore: China was no longer rising, China had already risen. But the biggest question remained unanswered. What comes next? Will China eventually surpass the United States and become the world's #1 superpower? Will cooperation between nations prevent global confrontation, or will economic rivalry, military tension, and technological competition push humanity toward a dangerous new Cold War? Some believe China's century has only just begun, while others argue internal problems may slow its momentum. Yet, whether people admire China, fear it, criticize it, or respect it, one fact remains undeniable: the story of the 21st century cannot be told without China. From a humiliated empire shattered by invasion and poverty to one of the most powerful countries on earth, China has rewritten history in ways few nations ever have, and the future of global power may depend on what happens next.